The result of all this was that the construction of the Soviets in the Central Asia really looked Russian. They were marginal, they were unrepresentative. In the Tashkent region, for example, there were no Muslims whatsoever in the Soviet. This was the primary source of communist power in Central Asia, and you had not one Muslim. They really lacked a local proletariat, and they questioned the attitude of locals towards the revolution. The Congress of Soviets declared that, quote, entry of the Muslims into the supreme territorial organ of revolutionary power is impossible because of the, quote, doubtful attitude of the local population and a lack of indigenous proletarian organizations. So again, Central Asians were far out on the side. What's a better way to put it? They were really sidelined because of their socio-economic position. It seemed like a colonialist proletariat. That's pretty much what it was. And this led to unprecedented unity among the Muslim elites who were opposed to this. Political leaders organized, and in December 1917, they called for regional autonomy in line with, quote, the principles proclaimed by the Great Russian Revolution, because the Russians preached a lot about autonomy, regional autonomy. And so these guys created a new breakaway government in Kokand. As this autonomy movement was taking shape in Central Asia, Russia was embroiled in a civil war. There were the whites versus the reds. The whites were the czarists, and they had help from the Brits and the US and the French. And then the reds, of course, were the communists. So in this context, it was very difficult for the Soviets to try to maintain control over Central Asia. The Tashkent Soviet was strangled off from Russia by Cossacks, who were on the side of the whites. Remember, these were fierce Tsarist loyalists, and the local communists were appealing to the Bukharan Emir to declare neutrality. The Bukharan Emir, by contrast, hoped to use the turmoil to gain his own autonomy, perhaps by pitting the Cossacks against the Soviets for now. So, as you can see, it's getting a little bit messy. Russians in the Tashkent Soviet sought local support by allying themselves with the Jadids in Bukhara. Remember, the Jadids were these modernizers, and the Jadids hoped this relationship would at least help them in their goal of modernization. But the Bukharan Emir brutally suppressed them, and this convinced Russians that Bukhara was essentially a counter-revolutionary center. Next, the young Bukharans in December 1917, with the Soviet backing and the Soviet military backing, offered to launch an uprising. Oh, excuse me, hold on, I'm looking for something here, and it's not working. Oh, hold on. Coming up. I just lost my notes. They're coming right back. This is like the longest pause you've ever heard. Right. The uprising of 1917. And so the young Bukharans promised that 80,000 rebels who were ready to rise up. And so eventually, the Soviets did support intervention, and the young Bukharans and the Russians were slaughtered. And then, and this was en masse, and they were forced to sign on to a peace treaty in March, and the Emir went about purging reformists and sympathizers. So attempts to gain control over the Bukharan Emir were a disaster. Only in 1920, more than 2 years after the revolution, did the communists finally succeed in taking down the Bukharan Emir. So how did the Russians finally succeed in taking him down? Well, there was increased acceptance of communists. More Muslims were brought into the Communist Party between 1917 and 1922. In part of this acceptance was based on promises of autonomy. There was also a distaste for colonialist whites. Even nationalists joined up because the alternative, signing on with the whites, and again, by the whites I mean the Cossacks and their supporters, the pro-Tsarist elements, were no good. They didn't like the alternative. The whites rejected autonomy, and the Reds promised autonomy. Part of the Russian communist ideology was based on autonomy for these various ethnic groups, which we'll talk about in the next class. So at least the rhetoric was there. The Bukharan Emir didn't fall because the Bolsheviks were popular. The Bolsheviks eventually regained Kokand from the Jadids by killing between 10 and 15,000 people in Kokand and destroying the entire city. This happened in late 1917 or early 1918. And then they took over the Khyber Emirate, partly through economic coercion at the end of 1919 and early 1920. All this did really little to endear the Bolsheviks to the Central Asians. So to the extent that there was To the extent that there was some acceptance for the communists around Tashkent and in the Bukharan Emir, that they didn't. This didn't mean that they liked the communists. It meant that they accepted them. In the other places, they didn't even accept them. They were taken essentially by force and by economic coercion. So the Russian Central Asian strategy during the Civil War period was really to seek support of these reformers, the Jadids, and as I mentioned, the young Bukharans to topple the Bukharan Emir. They also, again, promised autonomy to win the population over to the Bolshevik side, and they used force and economics as a tool to conquer the emirates when possible. Sorry, I should have showed this to you a second ago.